Welcome to Getting Your Hands Dirty, testing Magento 2. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here. This is actually, I thought this was the first time I'm talking about testing, but actually Fabian corrected me. I did one earlier, but that was when I was just starting out. Right, I didn't want to put the slide in. My wife said, put it in. Some people don't know you. So I'm a freelance developer and trainer. I don't know, you can been developing web apps most of my life actually, so far too long. So anyway, let's skip that. The more interesting topic today is testing. And I am very happy to be able to talk about testing because in a way, the whole move to Magento 2, a lot of people are learning again, and that's great. I think we as a developer community, we really like learning, but somehow this opportunity to really embrace testing has been, it's almost like people are missing this opportunity, right, to get to start using it more. And I don't mean testing in the way like going to the site in different browsers or manually trying to break a site or something like that. I mean code that tests itself, right? So, who's doing it already? Who's doing code that tests itself? Okay. All right, fair bit. So what tools are you using? Who's using PHP Unit? Almost the same people. I'm curious to see if others are using other tools. Is somebody using Behead and PHP Spec? Oh yeah. 5, okay. What about Selenium? Anybody using Selenium? Sorry? It's awesome. It's awesome? Very good, yeah, okay. So definitely some. Codeception, anybody using Codeception? Okay, now that's good. Good, if you're using something else, who's using something else? Nobody, okay, then I can skip that. All right. During this talk, I'll be introducing a couple of terms simply because it's useful to have some words when we're talking in the testing domain so we know what we're talking about, right? That might sound like buzzword bingo, and to that degree it's true, you can play that if you're familiar with it, but if not, I'll try to give you a brief, like pretty informal introduction of each of the words so you know what I think they mean, right? So the first buzzword here would be a unit test. And usually I ask, okay, what is a unit test? Well, a test for one unit. But what is a unit, right? What do you think? A class. A method.
It's something that does one thing and it does just that.
Okay, it does one thing. So here, the opinions diverge already, right? Different people think different things are a unit, and nobody's really right or wrong. So for me, a unit usually is a class. Each test usually tests a method, plus there might be private methods behind it, or maybe private classes if I extract them afterwards, right? So that still would be a unit, but different people have different opinions here. Right, so in Magento 2, we get a ton of unit tests, thousands of them, out of the box. And what's even better, or no, maybe not even better, but what's also pretty good is the tools to execute those tests are already installed if you have Magento 2 installed. Because with Magento 1, many people already stopped trying, just trying to get it to run. So that's no longer an excuse. With Magento 2, all you need to do is go to the drop to bash and type vendor bin php unit -c for configuration, and then the configuration file to use, and that's all you need. You will see a whole bunch of tests running. Now, that of course assumes you're in the root directory of Magento 2, and it's kind of cumbersome to type, so I generally recommend people create a little bash alias for that if you use this little prefix here, you will be able to run it from anywhere, and that's kind of handy sometimes. All you need to type is unit test, and you still can add additional arguments to it. It still works thanks to the alias command. So if you just want to run the test from one module, just add the directory path to that module after your command, and you just get those tests. So it's easy to run them, right? And I just want to go ahead and try that briefly. So let's see if I type vendor bin php unit -c dev tests integration, unit php unit xml dist. So before I start, I just want to check which version I'm on. 5.6, okay. And actually, I don't want to run all of them. Let's just run some. So in vendor Magento module catalog test unit block. Let's just do these, Right, so here you can see, okay, they run. It's all it takes. Everything's there in place. 161 tests just testing the block classes in Magento 2. And now, seems kind of useful, but a little abstract, but to give you a quick impression of how useful unit tests actually are is, if I now, for example, switch to PHP 7 here, right, and run the tests again, oh, look at that. Okay, 6 errors. So maybe I won't deploy Magento 2 on PHP 7 just yet, right? So just to check that actually was PHP 7. Yeah, okay. So we can see it's actually kind of handy. It's much quicker than going in and manually browsing the site to check everything still works. That's only one of the benefits unit tests provide. There are many more, but I won't go into those right now. So, second tier thing to talk about when testing, integration tests. Buzzword number 2, what's the difference between a unit test and an integration test? Any idea? Why do we need that distinction? Yeah?
Test a different unit together.
That's right, exactly. We want to test different units together, so real object interacting. In a unit test, I usually just have one class, and if it needs other classes to collaborate, I replace those other classes with test doubles. So I'm only actually running my own code in that one class. But with integration tests, I use different real objects and check they actually work together. And I don't know how often all my unit tests worked, but the integration tests broke. So they're really valuable to have. Right? You can't have one and skip on the other. You need both. Another big difference is integration tests need the runtime environment. So that's the database, that's the file system, that's the cache, all of that. You can't run the integration test without it, which also means integration tests are a lot slower, right? Connecting to the database, issuing queries, loading all the caching and so on. Yeah, that's a lot of overhead. But that's just necessary, unfortunately. Now, a big distinction between those two is if a unit test fails, it tells me exactly where in my code I have to go to fix it, right? Because it's just that one unit being tested. That's kind of handy. If an integration test fails, I just know something's broken. So additional debugging will be necessary afterwards. But still, I'd rather know something's broken quickly and easily and repeatably rather than not knowing it and having the customer tell me. So the Magento 2 testing framework actually gets a separate database, right? Because you don't want Magento running the test to mess up your real database. Okay, so there's a configuration file in dev test integration etc. It's called install config mysql, and you copy that to a file without the dist file ending, and then you can add your access credential to that testing database there, and then that's going to be used during your integration test runs. If you try to execute the integration test the same way we run the unit tests, just by, from the Magento root directory, running PHP unit with an integration test configuration file, so not the unit test, looks similar, but it's a different file, different subdirectory. We get an error, could not read dev test integration PHP unit XML. And the reason is not file system permissions or anything, that's a whole other story, but instead the reason is some of the tests are executed in a sub-process, so that assumes the current working directory to be the integration test directory. So to execute the integration test, we have to change the current working directory into dev test integration and execute them there. We don't even have to specify the configuration file flag because PHP unit picks up any configuration files in the current working directory automatically. All right, so that's how we can run them. And running the integration tests, each test run gets its own copy of the whole runtime environment. So it copies all the files from app.etc, and then it compiles all the files needs for static view assets, and all the var cache, var session, and so on. It changes the path to a sandbox directory within dev test integration temp, and then sandbox with a weird SHA-1 hash behind it. So just saying, if you run your tests and files aren't being generated that you're expecting to be generated, or maybe some caching issues appear, that's where you have to look, not in the real directories. Okay. Third buzzword I want to talk about is TDD, because we can't really talk about testing without talking about TDD. So what's TDD? What does it stand for? It's an acronym, obviously. Yeah?
Test-driven development.
test-driven development. Okay, sometimes I hear test-driven design, but I think it's actually test-driven development. Usually design doesn't work out quite as well. So that's what TDD is. I like to say TDD can be nicely summarized in the 3 rules of TDD, which were written down by Robert C. Martin. And the first rule is, I am not allowed to write any production code without having a failing unit test first. So that means I first have to write a test, and of course it fails because I don't have the code in place. There is no code, right? So it fails. And then as soon as I have a failing test, I have to stop writing the test and move over to making the test pass by writing production code. And the third final rule is, as soon as I have the test passes, I have to stop writing the production code and I have to go back and write another unit test that fails. And if I follow this cycle, it locks me into a quick stepping back and forth between writing a test, writing a production code, writing a test, and each cycle is maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and I get a very quick feedback loop of what I'm writing is actually working. And that's kind of handy. Now, TDD for Magento 2 is great. I do it, it's fun, but to be honest, it's no difference. There's no difference to doing TDD for anything else. For doing TDD for Magento 1, to doing TDD for Symfony apps or anything else. So TDD is not synonymous to automated testing. And TDD is great, I like it a lot, but because it's not really Magento 2 specific, I decided not to talk any more about TDD today. Or right now. If you do want to learn more about TDD, I really can recommend the video series from Robert C. Martin, aka Uncle Bob, on cleancoders.com, or do a training by, you could book me or any of the other great trainers around. There are many people teaching TDD. Right, so what I do want to talk about are more integration tests, because integration tests are very specific to the platform that I'm writing them on. I need platform knowledge, right? I need to know exactly how the platform works so I can write efficient tests for it. And that also has turned out for me personally to be a great way to learn about Magento 2, because thinking about how do I test this? I have no idea. So I have to go ahead and dig and learn about Magento 2. So that's been where I learned a lot about Magento 2 so far, honestly. So that's been fun. Now, Magento 2 provides a framework, a testing framework, that can be found in Dev Test Integration Framework, which makes our life as developers a bit easier. So I want to go over some of the features this integration test framework provides. It might help people who are just starting out trying to use it to write the first test there. So the first thing pretty much every integration test needs is the object manager, right? And we can always get an instance using Magento Test Framework Object Manager Get Instance. And it's been already prepared during the bootstrapping of the testing framework for us, and then we can create our objects instead of using new. And what does the Object Manager do? What is there for? Why can't we just use new? Exactly, dependency injection, thank you. So if I want to create some reader class, for example, I just call Object Manager create. And if this reader class needs any other dependencies, the Object Manager will figure that out and automatically create those recursively until it creates this reader class with all it needs. But more than that, I can also specify some of these dependencies if I have to. Like here in this example, if I want to instantiate this deployment config, I can tell the Object Manager, yeah, create this deployment config class, but for the constructor argument with a variable reader, please use this instance that I previously created instead. So in writing unit tests, integration tests, I am able to change just very specific parts of the system in a way that allows me to write my tests, right? So I can initialize the system in a certain state this way and then execute my tests. That's very handy. That's very basic knowledge that just has to be in place. Next, fixtures. Another buzzword. Fixtures fix the system into a known state. That's important because if I have a test that relies on a certain order being present, maybe with a pending payment, and it has to be a guest order, right? And only then this bug appears, and I want to write a test that exposes this bug so I can fix it and know the bug is actually fixed. Well, I have to create the order, and I have to create, with all the attribute it needs and so on. And so that's called a fixture. And if I don't take care of the fixtures, I get these tests that sometimes works and sometimes don't, and then they're useless, they're without value. So I really need to create fixes for integration tests here. And Magento makes it pretty easy to use database fixtures. And database fixtures are simple PHP scripts, and they live in directories, and they're specified relative to this directory here. And we can use a simple annotation above the test or above the test class to use them. So add Magento data fixture, and then just the path to the script. And in there, it just would look something like get the object manager instance, create an order, set values, call save. They're very, very basic, but very, very handy. And we can reuse all the fixtures the core provides us. I've been doing that quite a lot. It works great. That's handy. There's another type of fixture which are the configuration fixtures. And configuration fixtures are, of course, something like a system configuration value, and we can specify those with Magento config fixture annotation. And we just specify the store, which has to be the store code underscore store, not just the store code, and then the path and the value. And there's a special store code called current. And it's a good idea to use that unless you specifically want to write a test that uses multiple stores and values for multiple stores. Because current always means the current store. The only other store we can rely on that exists on every instance of Magento 2 is admin store. So that would also make sense, I guess. We can also specify global scope config fixtures just by omitting the store there. So it's easy to use and good to use. And finally, we have to talk a little bit about test isolation if we want to talk about unit testing here. So first thing to know is each test run gets a fresh install of Magento. So running the integration test, first of all, it runs bin Magento install with the clean database option. And it also rebuilds all this sandbox directory, so it copies over the config files, merges all the configuration, and that happens at the beginning of each test run, so that's kind of good. Actually, this behavior can be controlled by a flags setting in the PHP unit XML file. And test cleanup by default is enabled, so it will reinstall, but of course that takes quite a long time. So if you want to disable that, and I quite commonly do that while I'm writing my test, just setting that to disabled, well, 30 seconds less wait time every time I run the test. But of course, we do want to have that flag enabled in continuous integration, right? For sure. I mean, there it makes a lot of sense. But during development, yeah, I can save some time. So manual cleanup is required, and usually that means just removing the sandbox directory, and then it'll rebuild automatically the next time. All right. Then there's also the database isolation issue, meaning after each test, I might create an order, I might create a customer, I might change some settings, who knows, maybe a customer logs in, and all that happens in the database. And I don't want one test to start changing the database and then influencing the next test, because they use the same database. So thankfully, Magento runs each test in its own transaction. So that helps there. Normally, we don't have to worry about database isolation at all. And then there's also the application isolation, meaning, for example, any shared instances or in-memory changes, registry values, all those. They also shouldn't persist between tests. And that's why the runtime is reinitialized after each test. So that should take care of almost all global state. There's some that persist, but that's normally pretty safe. However, there are two annotations to change that behavior. Magento DB isolation and app isolation, and in this first version of the slides, I was going to details how that might be useful, but to be honest, without isolation, state persists. Weird things happen if state persists until, of course, only after the next test where the isolation is not disabled. But what I'm trying to say is don't turn off isolation, right? And all will work pretty good. There's very rarely a reason to turn off isolation, so it's pretty safe. Just be aware each test has its own runtime environment. Usually it's not recommended to share state between tests, and that's a good thing. All right. Application area, we have global, front-end, and admin HTML, like in Magento 1. And we can easily switch the area that the test runs in using the Magento app area annotation. There are more areas in Magento 2, actually. There's cron. We also had that in Magento 1, actually. But there's also now Web API REST, Web API SOAP, and maybe more I'm not aware of. And these can't actually be used with the Magento app area annotation, so that's only for these here. The others, if you try to use them, you get an exception because no design area is available there. We can still set them using code, so just know that's annotation for front-end and admin HTML. It works great. Okay, let's have I forgot to start my timer, so I'm not really sure how I'm doing time. I've got time?
No.
Good. So instead of doing a live example, I decided to put on the slides just for timing reasons. But in this little example I wanted to talk about, let's pretend we're trying to write an observer for the sales order place after event. Quite common thing, right? Happens a lot. And there are different things we can test along the way. So the first thing that I usually test, even though many people think that's superfluous, is the configuration. So usually I start writing an event observer by writing XML. So Magento 2, that would be the events XML file, and this would be an example test for some XML change. And here I get the event config class. So it's no longer Mage core model config. Now each config class has its own class. This is the events config class. And I can get a list of all observers for a given event, calling event config get observers. And then each observer, just like in Magento 1, each observer has a name. So I can check that there's a sub-array within this observers array for this event with my observer name. And then I can check if the configured instance that should be created when the event is triggered matches what I expect, and if it should be like a singleton or model, so that's a shared flag, if that's set to the value I want to. So it's actually, the tricky thing here is only figuring out which class to use. Once I have this is a cheap test to write, and so I write it. Because when might this test actually be valuable? Normally I won't refactor that, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, that might happen. I might decide, I might have misconfigured it into the wrong application area, and then suddenly my event isn't triggered. Because I have to test my event configuration anyway. I can do it either manually, right? Or I just write this bit of code. Another suggestion?
Someone is reusing your name.
Exactly. Conflicts are much less likely in Magento 2, but I've already seen it happen. And why does it happen? Copy and paste code, right? So people copy an event configuration over without changing the name, and suddenly, oops, this test would actually catch that. So there is value in testing the configuration. Right, okay. The next test that I usually write would be for the observer itself. And because in this case, we just said, let's create an observer. We can't really test that. It has to do something in order to test it. So I can't show you a test for that right now, right? We would need a specification to write tests. What should it do? Log something. So right now, I'll skip that part. That would be the TDD part, actually, writing the PHP. And then finally, I can write an integration test to check that my observer does what it should. And once again, since this observer for this talk doesn't do anything, we have to improvise. So I decided, let's just say, we'll just want to check our observer actually gets triggered on a real order placed thing. So first, this would be the test. I want to inject the mock observer, which would be I create a test double for my observer with an expectation. Get the order from a fixture file, right? So that's a Magento supplied order fixture. Get that, create the order management instance, and call place. So let's have a look at how this inject mock observer with expectation would look. Something like this. So just create a regular PHP unit test double. Could be any kind of test double, of course. Doesn't have to be a PHP unit test double. And then here is the expectation, and then there's a method register observer test double with the observer event name, observer name, and mock observer. And this looks something like this. And this is probably the most interesting of these example slides, because writing unit integration tests for Magento 2, I quite often found I have to manually, or for the test, I have to set up the configuration in a certain way. So what we're doing here is we're getting the event configuration data and then merging in additional array. It's like adding in another piece of XML into the picture. So here we're setting the shared flag to true on this event observer, and now the test framework object manager allows us to manually add shared instances. So because it's a shared instance now, once the event is placed, the mock event observer will be used that's already existed in the object manager. And then, if all goes well, the order fixture is loaded and placed, oh, that's just loading the order fixture, then the event will be triggered. Right? So, you know, writing integration tests is kind of expensive. That's just how it is. It's much more expensive, it takes more work than writing unit tests. So I usually write less, but I still think they're so valuable, so I still write them. Right? Okay, so go ahead and test all things. That's the message I want to leave you with. But before I finish up, one more thing. I'm starting a little project which I call Mage katas. And who's familiar with the idea of code katas? Okay, great. About a third. So code katas are a tool borrowed from martial arts, where the idea is you practice a certain movement so often that when you get into a real fight, you don't have to think about the movement anymore. Your body just knows what to do, and you can think about the more important things. And it's the same idea for writing code here. So we can practice doing TDD and other testing in practice, and then when we do real work, we don't have to think about it anymore. We simply do our work, and the testing is a lot easier. So this Mage katas here is a YouTube channel. It's a screencast series. You can get to the YouTube channel using the domain. Each of those episodes is about 15 minutes. It includes some examples of common Magento 2 tasks, like creating a module, creating a plugin, creating action controller, observer, whatever, you know, all these different things. And they're written in form of, so we can use them as kind of code katas. I've been doing that for some time because I really think, for me, code katas work great. I don't know, you know, if it worked for you, if you know the term, but I got a lot better at doing things while I was doing katas. So I just thought, yeah, let's make that public, and that might help introduce the topic of testing more widely to people so people don't miss the opportunity. Starting out with Magento 2 with testing. And I'll try to add a new episode every 2 weeks or so, I guess. That's at least my goal, right? So we'll see about that. I hope to stick to it, though. So that's my project for this year. And yeah, please give me feedback on it if you think it's useful or not, and so on. Looking forward to it. All right, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.
We have time for questions. Is there any questions for Vinai?
Right there?
Wait.
Can we get a...
Hi, my question is about Selenium testing. What happens if we change the front-end implementation with the Selenium testing provided by Magento 2?
Right. So, to be honest, so first of all, I don't do a lot of Selenium testing. I really just do, so usually in a project I might have 2,000 or 3,000 unit tests, I might have 500-600 integration tests, and I might have 10 Selenium tests, right? So it's much, much less, simply because of runtime and expense maintaining them for the reason you say. They break a lot. So there are certain strategies to deal with that, using page objects and encapsulating the design in one place and so on. But I haven't found like a true prime solution there. Yeah, they're just expensive tests in all ways.
So the thing I really struggle with is writing an integration test for something like, I guess, PayPal, where it has to come back with a certain state and how to test that. Any tips on that?
Yeah. So for PayPal or any other external API, for integration tests, I never use the real external API. It's far too unstable. I mean, PayPal's been down, right? I don't want my test to break just because PayPal goes down. So there are different ways to deal with external APIs. One way I've used quite a lot, to be honest, is just use a proxy to track what the responses are for a given request, and then I use that to mock the API and work against that. I don't like that approach a lot because that also requires a lot of manual maintenance if I have this one-to-one relationship. So I try to encapsulate the external API in a class that's my class, but it's basically just a wrapper for the external API, and then I just have to, it does nothing except translate my own logic to the external API, and then I just test against my internal class as a mock, even in integration tests.
Okay, so you do actually test the output of the real API then at some point? That's the biggest thing I need to test, like, is it still giving the same response?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So I've used this captured output from the external API to check if it's still giving me the same response. But to be honest, I didn't do that in an automated way. I just reran the script to capture the output, and then I did a manual diff to see, oh yes, it's changed again, right? So I don't run that on every build. This is more like, if something goes wrong, a quick way to check if it's actually changed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is there something like code coverage level reports or something?
Right. So code coverage is, yeah. So of course, I mean, Magento 2, you can easily collect the code coverage if you have enough RAM, so you can run the whole unit test suite with code coverage. But to be honest, I think it's a completely useless metric. Because it's very easy to write a test that creates a ton of code coverage without providing any value. And if I write code doing TDD, I get 100% coverage naturally. So I don't pay any attention to it, to be honest. Yeah, that's just my take on code coverage. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. Please reach out anytime during the day if you want to. Looking forward to it. Thank you.